Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the last session in the Join the Conversation speaker series, with this leg in particular being hosted jointly by the University of Guyana and the Center for Local Business Development. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Jainarine Deonauth, and I'm the Director of the Department of Events, Conferences, and Communication. Before we get fully into the program, please allow me to recognize amongst us here today our esteemed Vice-Chancellor, our 11th Vice-Chancellor, Professor Paloma Mohamed Martin, members of UG's senior management team. I believe some of them are joining us online. Our esteemed guest, our distinguished guest, Dr. David Goldwyn, Director of the Center for Local Business Development, Ms. Natasha Gaskin, of course, other senior members of the center. I see Nicola Balram here, whom we've worked with very closely to put this program together. So thank you very much. Our faculty and of course our students and those joining us online, welcome to all of you, and I hope that we'll have a good engagement with our distinguished guest today. So please have your questions ready, and let's have a good conversation. As I said to one colleague before, this is indeed a very, very timely conversation that we're having in Guyana's history. So, with Guyana being an emerging oil and gas powerhouse, today's talk, titled Managing Resource Wealth, What We Have Learned, by Dr. David Goldwyn, is very timely. It gives us an opportunity as a university community to engage with an expert and to have our views also heard. So we are very thankful for this opportunity. Before I introduce our esteemed Vice-Chancellors to make comments, I'm advised that we need some health and safety tips. So I'll call on the coordinator for the Health and Safety Coordinator for the CLBD, Mr. Akil Lewis, who will take us through that process. Mr. Lewis, please. Please put your hands together for him as he comes.
All right. Good morning, everyone. We at the center take a moment for safety before we start any of our events. Events outside of the center will be no different. There are no planned drills for today, but if you guys hear an alarm or you're asked to leave by any of the center or UG officials, we have the assembly point outside in the parking lot on the far left. Now, there's only one exit to this building, which is the entrance you came in, and I'll ask you to assemble there until we give the okay to come back in the building or until we've accounted for everyone so we can then disperse. We do have, unfortunately, a couple of trip hazards around. Based on how the equipment is set up, there isn't anything we could have done about it. Please be cautious about the cars that are going to be ran throughout the floor in ELT. I do see a couple of students, so I do want to take this opportunity to talk about fatigue management. When I was here as a student, I was king for last minute presentations, king for last minute group assignments, king for last minute preparation for exams. And now that I've progressed in my career in safety, I know that these things that we do early have long-term effects on our minds and our bodies. So my advice to you is get started early. Assignment is given with a due date of 2 weeks. Start the day off. There's no reason not to start immediately. When you wait, it snowballs. And then once you're late one time, everything else is forced to be done late. So for my students, that would be my safety advice to you. But that's all for our safety moment right now from the CLBD. Thank you, guys.
So there you have it. We're all hopefully safe once we take those guidance from Mr. Lewis. So now it's my pleasure to invite our distinguished Vice-Chancellor, Professor Paloma Mohamed Martin, who will deliver opening remarks. Please put your hands together for her as she comes.
Good morning, everyone. Distinguished guest speaker, Mr. Goldwyn, Dr. Gaskin, all the members of the Center for Local Business Development who are here. I'm not going to call name single people out, all who are here from the private sector students, our staff online. I see Doc in the back. Nice to see you after 5 years. I'm not going to speak for long because I want to apologize for getting here late this morning. I miscalculated that there was going to be a traffic outside. Apparently there was an accident and we had a little bit of problems getting in. And so I apologize. I want to help you to make that time up again. But apart from the fact that we are very delighted after a long hiatus for COVID, which did not allow us to be together and to really have these very significant conversations, we did do some online, but they're not the same as having the person in the flesh. So if it's your first time to Guyana, I'd like to welcome you to Guyana and of course to welcome you most warmly to the University of Guyana. We are happy that the center has our alum around, many of them. Some of them can give good advice for their bad behavior in the past. That's very good. And I can tell you some of those last minute things are what we're dealing with now as students try to graduate and realize this and that, and but that's how we all are. I also see a former student president at the back. So we're happy to have our grads working on this project, working with the center, doing tremendous work, and also sharing what they know. If I were to begin this morning by just asking for a moment of contemplation for peace in the world, I'd like to do that, not only for peace wherever there is conflict in the world, but also for peace that is threatening our own country at this moment with the border issue with one particular country. Why am I choosing to do this? I'm doing this with every single meeting I have inside university and outside because it's important for us to think about these macro issues and these wider things, which we may think may not affect us directly, but the world is one large ecosystem and getting more and more intertwined as we go forward. I wonder if our neighbor, who is making all kinds of statements and taking all kinds of postures, would have been as interested in doing so had we not been a resource-rich country. Had the resources that are in that particular part of the country not been now well-known and now ripe for exploration, discovery, and use, production and use. So we see things are not exactly disconnected. They're all part of one big web or complex. In our own country, one of the huge problems that we've had to address early on in dealing with the advent of exploitable amounts of oil and gas in the country has been this question of managing expectations and really getting people to understand, one, how not only how this industry functions, how complex it is, how it functions, but also how resources coming from that industry are to be distributed and to be understood. The university has had a very, very close ringside seat as this process developed. One, we were very integral in working with the teams that developed the Natural Resources Fund, very, very integral, not only on the policy side in leading consultations across the country in 2019, 2018. We were also very involved in leading the consultations and working on some of the documents for the first and second local content policies. We're also very involved, of course, in training and education. and in training and education that cannot be delinked from the resources, because it doesn't matter how much money you have floating around. If your people are not equipped and able to take advantage of the opportunities and the funding that might be around, then we are not going to get very, very far. And so, Mr. Goldwyn, I'm so very, very, very thankful to you for coming this morning, and I think reigniting this conversation in an organized, systematic, and non-histrionic way. Because most of the conversation that we see, unfortunately, around these matters, and the university has to take some responsibility for this, we'll fix that soon. These conversations are really about opinion and people's feelings, and not really grounded in what is the knowledge, practice, and process for this really complex and big agenda that the country has now put forward and really has to have. UG will, now that we've gotten ourselves fairly back together after COVID, begin our Turkey and Talk series again, etc., so that we will begin to help the country and others, including our students, to place these conversations within a strong, grounded, empirically based context. But we are happy, therefore, that the first, but the last for CSBD, but the first for us begins with you. So thank you all for coming. There's a lot to chew upon, and I'm sure this will not be, it's last for the year, but not the last such encounter. We wish you all the best in Guyana. Guyana, of course, is known for being one of the most hospitable, if not the most hospitable country in the world. And so I am sure that you already feel that. But if you don't, could we give him a rousing round of applause? So you have that virtual hug from all of us. Thank you and welcome. God bless.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, for providing that historical background as to UG's work in this field in particular, and for setting the stage for Dr. Goldwyn's presentation a bit later on in the program. So, as VC mentioned, we've been working along with the CLBD on a number of projects, and this is one of them. And I'm very, very happy that we're doing well. We've collaborated well in these projects. So we're fortunate to have with us the center's director, Dr. Natasha Gaskin, with us. So she will come and make some remarks and introduce the main speaker for today. So please put your hands together for her as she comes. Dr. Gaskin.
Thank you. Good morning, Vice-Chancellor, fellow representatives from the various faculty, students, David, my fellow staff members. It's always a pleasure to be back at the university. This is where I certainly started my grounding in university education. So I myself, I'm a former student of the economics department. So always very happy to be here, and always very proud when I see our Vice-Chancellor, because of course we have a woman who is heading the institution. And it's certainly, you know, something that we can all look up to as young women here at the university pursuing your studies. So today I'm tasked with introducing David, but before I introduce him, the Join the Conversation series would have started back in 2020. And throughout this series, we have always partnered with the university because, of course, the students, as well as lecturers, other staff members, our academic society, play a very pivotal role when it comes to influencing policy. Professor would have mentioned the various stakeholder engagement that they would have held, as well as engagements with policymakers. And so whenever we have these series, the university plays a pivotal role. Last year, we would have had Dr. Zainab, and we were in the GWLT lecture theater, and that was a very good session on economic diversification. And so David today is with us, once again, engaging on managing this wealth. Because now Guyana is so well known around the globe because of our oil and gas wealth that we have. But we want to ensure that we manage it in an efficient way so that every citizen can benefit from the opportunity. And of course, the university plays a pivotal role in the management of that wealth. So David is a globally recognized thought leader, educator, and policy innovator in energy security and the extractive industry transparency. He has served as the U.S. State Department's Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs, as well as the Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs. He also served as National Security Deputy to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Bill Richardson, and Chief of Staff to the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Most recently, Mr. Goldwyn served on the steering committee and was a key facilitator of the Climate Action Solutions Center on the sidelines of COP26, which was held in Scotland. Mr. Goldwyn has published extensively on topics related to energy security and transparency. He's the co-editor of Energy Security Strategies for a World in Transition, just to name a few. His most recent publication include The Resource Curse, Advice for Investors and Partners, and Caribbean Energy Security. And so today he's going to be here speaking with us on managing the resource wealth. So ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Mr. David Goldwyn.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. It's really a privilege to be here at the University of Guyana. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for that very generous introduction, and Natasha for yours as well. Guyanans helping Guyana is the key to your future, and I think Natasha's work and the center's work is really a classic example of that, helping Guyanese business to take advantage of this resource wealth and to enter the economy. So really a privilege to be here. I appreciate Program Chairman, the promotion to doctor, but I'm very sensitive that I'm in an academic institution. I have a law degree, I have a master's degree. I am not a PhD, so I'm not a doctor, so apologies to the Academy for that one. On this issue, I've had the benefit of looking at the resource curse from really three different angles. As a member of civil society, I did a lot of research in this. I published some papers, and I was part of the formation of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative in the early 2000s to try and figure out whether empowering civil society to have information about what money the government has and verifying that the government has received the money that the company says it has paid them was one step. And I learned from that transparency and disclosure and verification is really important, but it's not really sufficient, and it did not really produce better outcomes. When I was in the government, I started something called the Energy Governance and Capacity Initiative. So we looked at 10 countries that had resource potential and thought, I was trying the thing that hadn't been tried. What if we talk to the central banks and finance ministries and petroleum ministries before they get the resource and before they get the money and teach them how to do that? And Guyana was the first country of those. So this is my second trip to Guyana. I was here in 2010, and we started a 7-year program of technical assistance to the finance ministry, the petroleum ministry, and the central bank. Time will tell whether it was effective or not, but that was the second thing that hadn't been tried. And now, in my role, I'm advising companies on how to be good citizens and also stakeholder groups. So it's a real challenge. The resource curse, or the paradox of plenty, as people have talked about it, is this really unfortunate outcome that when countries rely on a single source of a natural resource, diamonds, oil, gas, whatever, for a significant amount of income, it turns out that most of the time, development outcomes are worse 10 years later, 20 years later, than before they ever got the resource. That's what they call the paradox of plenty. Nigeria's roads are worse now than they were 30 years ago. They were an exporter of agriculture, now they're an importer. So, for trillions of dollars that come into the economy, why does this happen? So that's the paradox of plenty. And then what they call the Dutch disease is another part of that, which is the fact that your currency appreciates as you export a very valuable resource, and and then everything else that you make becomes more expensive, and other sectors atrophy, and so you end up losing diversification in the economy. So what's unfortunate is that you can probably count on one hand the number of countries that have been through this experience and have succeeded. Norway, Botswana, Chile, Canada, Malaysia is doing pretty well. That's about it. The horror stories of countries that have earned trillions of dollars and had bad incomes, you need to look no farther than your neighbor Venezuela, which had enormous amount of money. It has worse electricity than it did 30 years ago. It has bridges that have been fallen down. It has in a state of atrophy despite dispersing all of this money. So what I want to, about a year ago, I started the process of figuring out, after 20 years of trying to deal with this problem, longer, but 20 years that I've been looking at it, what have we learned? Why does this problem exist? What are the strategies? And then what are recommendations for do things better? So that's what I want to talk to you about today, and then a little bit about the role that you have to play. So let's go to the first slide, and maybe the next one in. So this is really the three main points that I would want to make to you. One is that countries have really struggled to make good use of this resource, and struggle to have social peace, struggle to have economic advantage, struggle to have the politics catch up with the economy. And this is really the political problem, which is that the economy grows much faster than the growth of the institutions which are supposed to regulate it and manage it. So you're always playing catch up. The second is that host governments have a role to play and companies have a role to play, but everybody pretty much needs to stay in their lane. Sorry, thanks. Everyone really needs to stay in their lane. So governments need to be doing the job of regulation, supervision, and oversight. Companies need to be primarily developing the resource. They can help build schools, they can help with power plants, but you really don't want them to be in that role for too long, because that's not really what they do. Oil and gas companies produce oil and gas, and they can support indirectly the rest of the economy, but you don't want to rely on them to do government work. And then, so let's skip to the next slide. So this is a little bit of why do we have these problems? So historically, the challenges government have when they get all of this resource wealth is, first, this pace of economy is really misaligned with the political context. So what do I mean by that? A lot of what governments need to do to take advantage of wealth is build institutions. Institutions that regulate, institutions that spend wisely, institutions that monitor whether the money you've spent is getting spent. Is that road really getting built? Is that factory really getting built, or did somebody just write a check? And they're playing catch up, and it takes time. The other misalignment is that governments work on political cycles every 4 years or 5 years. They need short-term results. But to take advantage of wealth, you need long-term investment, things that are going to pay off near. Even building a road network for Guyana, you can start it now. You'll have 2 more presidents before that road work is done. So you have to have politicians and governments that are willing to do long-term things, even though they face short-term responses. The second is that there's a temptation for governments to favor their allies, either their domestic allies or their foreign allies, in procurement and in value chain development. People want to help their friends. They don't necessarily help everyone. And sometimes your friends, as you all know, your friends are not always the greatest people you might rely on to do a job. They might be your friends, but they might not be the best at the thing you're asking them to do. So there has to be equity and even distribution. And that's been a real problem for a lot of governments. The other is disappointed expectations between governments and investors. Investors, the investors here are building 30-year projects. They're going to spend for the first decade, but the expectations are you're creating wealth. Where's my benefit now? Why am I having to wait 10 years? You can't really do much about that. That is inherent in the relationship but it is a misalignment and it is a source of friction. And then governments are often incentivized to share this wealth with their political and social allies rather than distribute it. And then you create internal conflict, sometimes external conflict, the way Professor Mohamed talked about it. But in Chad, in Nigeria, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in a lot of places, you have internal conflict because when the government has access to wealth, then it becomes a game of capture the government. And whoever captures the government captures the wealth if you don't have a government which distributes it widely. And that leads to sometimes civil war and sometimes just friction. So every government that has had resource wealth has had to face this challenge. The symptoms that you see are this decline in civil liberties and public accountability. Governments, if people are tempted to take the money, they don't want transparency. They don't want to disclose. They don't want to be audited. They don't want external responsibility. And so there's a temptation to not be public about it. And so that's one problem. Another one is that if you don't have to tax people in order to deliver benefits, then you lose your connection between government and citizenry. And this is, you see the problem in the Middle East, and you end up with authoritarian governments because they don't really need the consent of the governed to govern. So that's why people sometimes talk about distributing payments so you can tax them back, so you can sustain that relationship. Often a worsening of corruption and authoritarianism. The temptation of huge amounts of money is a real temptation. And when you start off with economies where civil servants are not paid well, government officials are not paid well, everybody in the population is not paid well, then it becomes competition for capture the money through means other than legitimate means. This is the Nigeria case, is probably the worst, but Venezuela also, where trillions of dollars has ended up in Swiss bank accounts from governors of countries and multiple presidents, which then get traced later while the country has grown deeper into poverty. So that's a problem. The overvaluation and distortion of the currency we've talked about, as well as the atrophy of non-extractive industries. So you want to use money for development, but if you don't invest in agriculture, if you don't invest in roads, if you don't invest in productivity, if you don't invest in universities, if you don't change the way you educate people to create craftsmen and tradesmen, then all you have is a foreign operator producing money for a government, and then people are trying to get that government money. And then this internal conflict and resentment over the distribution of wealth. So this is why it has gone wrong pretty much everywhere in the world where this has happened, except for a handful of countries. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we talked about this misaligned incentives and what governments need to do and why investors are different. And you're seeing that right now. People are saying, where's my dividend? I want the money now. And the government is saying, we're not going to have a lot of money until 2027. And the money we want to build bridges. That's a $500 million bridge. We're going to build roads. That's a $500 million road. We don't have extra money left over yet, but people are impatient because they see the oil price and they're wondering, where's my dividend? This is a misalignment, but it takes patience. Let's go to the next slide. So the way governments have tried to deal with this, or the way advisors have suggested governments deal with this wealth, the first is sovereign wealth funds. And I've got a picture there which shows the world's biggest sovereign wealth funds. It's a little hard to see the flag there, but you've got Norway, sort of at the top. You've got Singapore, you've got Abu Dhabi, you've got Hong Kong, Kuwait. And these funds, which are shown by the size, the billions that they have under management, have one thing in common. They're all independently managed. They're not managed by the government. The government appoints the head of the sovereign wealth fund, and they have professionals running it, and they don't change with the election. Norway's investment fund, that's the top bar, trillions of assets under management, which provides money which can go back to the budget and goes for future generations to make sure that when the oil is gone, the country still continues to develop. But they're not allowed to invest in Norway. They have to make their money elsewhere so you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And this has kept successive governments in these places from putting their hands in the till and saying, oh, this guy Sam Friedman called me up. He's got an FTX fund. Maybe I'll put my money in there. How about Bitcoin? How about real estate? There's a long list of countries with sovereign wealth funds that are on that list, and those are the ones that are politically controlled. And there are horror stories like Nauru, which had a bauxite boom in the 70s. Small population, huge wealth, might have been the wealthiest country in the world, and they invested their money in real estate and an airline, and then they had a bauxite bust. And now they remain, as they have been for the last 30 years, one of the poorest countries in the world. They never came back. So independent management, really important. Amending, updating the fiscal and legal frameworks. Ghana and Botswana have really world-class ones. What those have in common is they have external accountability from citizens who keep an eye on what's going on in the business. And the government has an obligation to explain, this is where our royalties are, this is where our taxes are, this is what's coming in, this is how we're planning and developing things. External accountability makes a huge difference. The third is independent agencies with regulatory responsibility. I've talked to your finance minister about this and others. Civil servants need to have civil service protection. They need to not get fired when the government changes. They need to have job security. They need to be paid well. They need to be professional. Public administration, those degrees are going to be important. And that means that when a new government comes in, they get all the professional advice about how the business runs. And if they have wacky ideas, I was a government official, I had wacky ideas. I had the civil servant say, yeah, that was an interesting idea. We tried that and it failed twice. So maybe you want to think about whether that's a good idea or not. But our regulators do a couple of things. They protect the integrity of the business. They provide stability. They also provide investor confidence. So you look next door in Brazil or in Colombia. Now, Brazil has had huge political swings, Lula to Bolsonaro and back to Lula. But their regulator, hugely respected around the world. And if you're doing business in Brazil, you know your contract is not going to get torn up. You know your regulation is not going to change. They're not going to double your taxes. They're not going to say all of a sudden you're not meeting standards, because you have professional regulators. So it brings money and confidence into the country. Guyana is not there yet, but that's where I think Guyana needs to go. And then a fiscally responsible revenue distribution system. Now, in the early days of development, you need to invest in infrastructure and productivity. But at some point, in order to provide equity, you need to think about providing some payments to citizens. Now, if you provide too much, you end up like some countries in the Middle East, where essentially you undermine the incentive to work and no one works, and the country is populated with foreign workers who are treated as second-class citizens who do all the work. You don't want that. Alaska, we give as an example, it's like $500 a month. It's not enough to not work. It's helpful. It's helpful over time if you want to start a little business. I think that's in Guyana's future, not its present. You have to strike a balance between investment in the country and productivity and equitable distribution of the wealth. You can do it lots of different ways. You can make it conditional on going to school. You can make it conditional on accessing health care. But I think at some point that's probably in your future. Next strategy. Companies have a responsibility. They have a responsibility to do their job and produce the revenue, and they have a responsibility to be good partners. And Guyana has been blessed with good partners. There have been a lot of different strategies on how companies can help. Development partnerships. Chevron did this in Angola. They worked with USAID, our development agency, to try and find projects. It worked for as long as that project lasted, but then it finished. You have, it's called revenue sharing. It's sort of mislabeled, but it's temporary help. So an Italian company, ENI in the Congo, needed a power plant for its operations. It built one big enough for 100 miles around. And it's a BOT, they call it build, operate, transfer. So in 25 years, they'll give that over to the government. But in the meantime, they're not building something and walking away from it, hoping the government will run it. They're providing benefit for themselves. They're sharing that benefit with the community. That's a pretty good strategy. Sector-specific development. Exxon has done a lot on malaria in Africa, and here they're helping promote vocational training and the crafts that the crafts that will be needed in Guyana, not just in the oil sector, but in every sector of the country. And then anti-corruption efforts. Now, these are things like EITI, publish what you pay. The job of companies is to cooperate and disclose. And I have to say, I was a member of US EITI. We had a big fight with our own oil and gas companies about the volume and the amount and the frequency with which they were going to disclose. It's like, hey, it's the US. We're all about transparency. We still had to have that fight. It didn't actually go terrifically well, but companies have an obligation to cooperate. And then revenue generation, job one for companies, which is produce value and do it in a fair way. Go to the next slide. So what are the recommendations for governments in general and for Guyana's government in particular? One is to have these independent regulatory bodies. You can have external partners who can provide expertise and that can help, but you've got to build these institutions so that you have quality spending. Guyana is going to spend enormous amounts of money, billions of dollars on roads, bridges, health, education. Quality spending is really hard to do. How do you write the tender? Do you have oversight to make sure the thing that you're paying for gets built? Are you picking a person who has the credentials to do the work that you want? you really need an independent regulator to at least oversee it and to check on it, or bad things can happen. And it's protection for the government too, because it's easier to resist a temptation when your hands are tied. It's not in your control. Equitable fiscal regime, I think you want to design a fiscal regime that's fair to citizens and predictable for investors. So that means a couple of things. That means designing a system that pays your investor. Now, the first round of investors, they take a lot of risk, they get a lot of reward. Second round, take less risk, a little less reward. In the future, third round, maybe not very much risk at all. It'll be a modest amount of reward. So it changes over time, but it also needs to be fair. So Mexico came up with a system where they had a variable royalty. So within a certain range, the royalty was X, but if there were extraordinary rents where there was oil goes to $150 a barrel, they split that excess rent, on a formula that was agreed between the government and the company, because the company shouldn't get all the windfall, but not everything that a company makes is a windfall. So that's how they struck that balance. Saving funds and responsible fiscal policy, that's really important. For all the things that make a difference in economy, we can talk about local content if you want. The number one thing that makes a difference is macroeconomic management. Do you manage inflation? Do you manage the exchange rate? How do you spend, and do you spend in quality? You get that wrong, nothing else you do really matters. You're gonna wreck the economy, and you're not gonna have development. You get those things right, you can afford a lot of mistakes, and you can do things over again. So that's really important. And last is practice transparency. EITI is a great starting point. That's it's simply just verifying what are the companies paid, what do the government get for every extractive industry, mining, oil, gas, so that the citizenry knows where's the money. Did it go in the budget? Did it go in the natural resource fund? Did it go someplace else? Or is it missing? If it's missing, then you have accountability. But you need to practice transparency in procurement. You need to have a public tender so that anybody who is qualified can apply. You need to verify that spending. You need to have external accountability, and no government wants external accountability. My government doesn't want external accountability, but we have it in there, and it's the way you manage to deter corruption, because people are going to do bad things. It's just inevitable. You're never going to prevent someone from trying to steal, or maybe even successfully stealing money or stealing a contract. That's not your goal, zero mistakes. Your goal is accountability, which is having a system that when something goes wrong, it's detectable, and then there's accountability. So that kind of transparency across the value chain, not just in oil and gas, is really important. I think is there one more slide, or is that it? So that's really, how things are, how things have been dealt with the resource curse and these recommendations. I want to say two more things. One is that implementation is really hard, and I am sympathetic to this government and to any government that comes here, because the advice you get from the World Bank, from the IMF, from everybody else is spend for development, but don't spend too much because you're going to inflate the economy. Provide local content, but don't lock out foreign investors who have the best technology and capital that you need. Grow the private sector, but don't prevent people who have good technology outside from coming in and opening businesses here and hiring local. Maybe not everything has to be a Guyanese business. And hurry up and do this quickly, but don't be wasteful while you're doing it. So it's really hard. So I have sympathy for the government and very well in those decisions. And I've said a couple of times during my trip here, the advantage of coming last is you get to learn from everybody else's mistakes. So that's a benefit. And I'm optimistic that this government wants to get things right, and that it has the top line policies in place: natural resource fund, regulatory reform, low carbon development strategy, natural resource fund. These are all the headline kind of textbook things you want to do, but that's just step one. The implementation stuff is hard. And that leads me finally to where you all fit in. Guyana is going to need a lot of help, and you have a small population. It's going to need craftsmen and tradesmen, or craftspeople and tradespeople, electricians, plumbers, builders. In World War II in the US, the men went off to war, but we had to produce all this weaponry in order to fight the war. And the national hero was Rosie the Riveter. It was a woman in a hard hat because the women ran the defense factories and built the tanks and the ships and the planes that were used to fight the war. And neither the war nor the economy would have survived without them. So one, I would say, even though I'm in a university setting, show some love and some respect for tradesmen and craftsmen. And at least in the US, this world is changing. We're no longer requiring four-year degrees in a lot of states for jobs because they don't require it. You all have free school here, but now we're just getting to free trade schools because we don't have enough people. And my plumber drives a better car than I do. So these can be really well-paid jobs. So I think that's really important. So you're going to need builders, you're going to need managers, project managers, financial managers. You're going to need economists to make sure that you get your spending right. And you're going to need teachers and nurses and entrepreneurs. So what you learn here, what you do here is really important. I would encourage you before you get to graduation day to work in a field, work in an office. Don't graduate and be the person who's applying for a job who has never had a job or who has never worked in an office before. Because someone who hires, it's like, do I have to teach them everything? How to get along with your colleagues, how to be nice, how to be respectful, how to be part of a team. So you have a chance for an internship or an apprenticeship. I would say try and do that before you leave and get some sort of experience. I think those are really important. I think the future of Guyana is going to bring a lot of people who are not in the workforce into the workforce. Gender equity, the role of women will be incredibly important. It's an underutilized national resource. And so showing, I would say one is don't assume that any particular kind of job has a gender qualification to it. So anyone can be a welder, anyone can be a manager, anyone can be president. My country is still trying to learn that one, but it's true. But there's a lesson for administrators here and for teachers, which is that this world is changing. And so teaching innovation, teaching problem solving, learning about AI, learning to work with modern tools, can't necessarily use the old methods for the new economy. So I would say, look at the degrees that Guyana is going to need. It's going to need project management, project evaluation. It's going to need a lot of procurement expertise. It's going to need public administrators who know how to run government programs and manage. And that may be new, but offering those degrees and those qualifications, and I would say offering the opportunity for people to get through in 2 years, perhaps, and learn a craft and be certified and competitive, I think is important too. So that's a lot to do for everyone, but I think that I've experienced Guyanese hospitality and I've experienced Guyanese professionalism and expertise, not only from Natasha and the center, but your colleagues and your diplomats. So I'm really optimistic that you have the potential, but you as students, you as citizens really have a big job to do to raise your standards of what you expect from your government, what you expect from your investors, and what you expect from yourselves in terms of joining the workforce. So I'm optimistic you're going to succeed, and I wish you luck. Now let's get to the fun part.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mr. Goldwyn, for your presentation. So, and I can assure you that UG is a step ahead in terms of the programs we're offering in oil and gas, preparing our students well for this sector. So we now move to the question and answer segment. For those online, I am asking you to place your questions in the chat, and we'll have those questions read and answered. For those of you who are here, please indicate by a show of hand, and you can identify yourselves, and you can ask your questions. So shall we start with in-person audience first?
I can always call on people too. It's a university, right? That's allowed?
Okay, so do we have any question online, and then we come back in person? I see some of our students here. Perhaps I can start in the meantime. They're getting their questions, Mr. Goldwyn. So you've really given a good review of Guyana so far in terms of the way that we have set up, we're preparing for the sector, more particularly in relation to setting up the Natural Resources Fund and the regulatory framework that we're currently working and putting in place, and some of it we have done already. What do you think we could do as a country to maintain the level of progress we're making in terms of our preparations for the sector, given your experience with countries who have done well in this area?
I would say three things. Thank you for the question. I think the first one is I think the government needs to strongly consider independent management of the Natural Resource Fund. I think it's important. You know, it has excellent fiscal rules. There's great budget discipline about how much can go into the budget, and there's excellent transparency about how much has been taken out and where it's going. But over time, that fund is going to grow dramatically starting in 2027. And it's going to be a lot of money to manage, and you want to put those measures in place before it grows to that size. So I would say independent management is sort of job number one. Second, not very sexy, civil service reform. I think that's really important. You have to invest in the ability to govern not only the oil and gas sector, but to govern the growth of the economy to make sure that money is used wisely. That requires civil servants. It requires a government job that pays well, that has job security, that has professional qualifications to get that job, and has stability. And there is some of that right now in some agencies, but there is not enough. Mostly, there are not enough people in the agencies to do what they need to do. And you cannot just run people into the ground. So civil service reform, you can't cut a ribbon on it. You can't go to a town and announce it. So for a politician, this is not a very interesting thing to do, but it's legacy. It's what you do to build the institutions of the future. So that would be, I would say, job number two. And job number three, I would think, would be a commitment to look at the part of the economy that's going to be the biggest, which is the investment in infrastructure, and take a good look at making sure that that system of tendering, the system of monitoring how that spending is going, is in place and is professional before you start spending that big money. So there's time to do that. I would say there are models around the world for that. There was actually, when Nigeria had a good period, there was a budget monitoring institution. All they did was have auditors and examiners, and they went out and examined public contracts to make sure the road was being built or the housing development was being built. And when they found that it wasn't, they reported them, and the people were prosecuted. Had a really disciplining effect on the willingness of people to not waste money. So you need a system of accountability. So I would say building that system of accountability for public spending would be number three.
Good. Thank you. I'm told we have a question online. Siobhan, please.
Yes. So we have Ms. Young asking, how can the resource curse paradox be addressed in Guyana based on countries like Nigeria? And how can we, as a nation, overcome?
No, it's the however many $1 trillion question, for the economy. I think kind of the recommendations I made here are really the keys. You have to have transparency, you have to have accountability, you have to have good planning, and you have to have oversight. I think those are the keys. You need to spend the money wisely, you need to diversify the economy, you need to control the macroeconomy and not have inflation, which is going to destroy the other parts of your economy, and you have to have patience. And I think that's what you have to do. For the government, it means you have to explain things, how long it's going to take, and what you're going to do. And for the citizenry, you got to be a little patient, because it's not going to happen as fast as everyone wants it to have. But if you can explain what the timeline is, maybe people will be more patient with you.
You. Do we have any students who would wish to ask a question? Okay, Dr. Gaskin.
Hi, David. If you can explain a little bit, I know you used the example of Botswana, and I remember in the past that they were in Guyana recruiting some of our teachers to go to Botswana. So if you can explain a little bit, I know you use it as a best practice, how the academic institutions interacted with the policymaker, that partnership in terms of the development of that country.
Interesting. Well, I only know a little bit about sort of how the academic part of it worked, but Botswana's model was first they got a lot of assistance in running government institutions the first 10 years after the diamond boom. So they had a lot of help in learning how to govern. The second thing is they had these diversification plans, and they were patient about putting money in there, putting money aside, and developing other industries. And for now, better than half a century, they've maintained it. But they also invested in education. And so they not only invested in education, they hired the people who were educated, they valued their teachers, and they valued the degrees that they have. And then they went from the point where they were not only where people in Africa were going to learn, but I guess as you all experienced, they were going elsewhere to teach. But academic partnerships, I would say in Botswana and every place else, are indispensable in so many ways. They're indispensable for research and development, because that's where you all are the incubators and experimenters of new thought and new practice. It's where you develop your seed corn for the workforce of the future, and it's where you teach people the important soft skills that they need in the workplace, which is how to work as part of a team, how to be accountable for your mistakes, how to be a good colleague, how to be prepared, and to learn what happens when you're not prepared, when the stakes are a little bit lower than they are in the workplace. So I think that's really important. And we're even in the United States, we're learning this importance of the interaction with universities because we're trying to build an offshore wind industry. We've never had offshore wind. We have a great labor force. They've never built an offshore wind platform. They've never built a monopile. They've never built these nacelles. The engines are manufactured overseas. We want to do that at home. So the first thing that our big investors did when they put in a bid to build an offshore wind platform is a partnership, in one of the cases in New Jersey, with New Jersey Institute of Technology, and asked them, can you start a master's program and can you start undergraduate programs that will train people how to do this work? We're not going to be able to hire these people for 5, 7, 8 years, but we're going to be hiring them for the next 30. So can you get started? And so they invested in the university, and the university will produce graduates. And that's going to be replicated all across the country. So you sometimes don't have what you need. Botswana figured out what it didn't have and produced it, and now they're still doing well.
Okay, yeah, so one question from our student.
Oh, yeah, so we're from the Economic Society. We would like to know how we can manage resource wealth. What is our role in that?
As economists?
Yes.
Yes. It's a really important role. There's so many parts of public spending. So one thing economists are great at is designing ideal systems. So the first thing you have to figure out is how do you design the project? Are you really going to have, what's the right scale? Are you going to have one contractor build the entire road network? Probably not. Do you need competition in the sector? So all the things you learn in economics. How do you maintain competition? How do you define the market? What skills do you need? Market design, procurement design, that's one job. Then there's the management part of economics, which is what's the tendering system? What are pre-qualifications? How do you make sure only people who are qualified can bid? Are you setting the bar too high? Can you do it domestically? Do you need foreign? And then you've got the pricing mechanism. Is it cost plus? Is it fixed price? Do you really want the low bidder on a national network, or do you want a certain level of credibility? It's really intricate and complicated how you design that bid, because once you have the bid, the bidder is not going to do anything that's not in that list. Even local content, how do you build that in there to make sure that they hire locally but only qualified locally? So that design of the bidding system is also economics. And the last part is monitoring and evaluation. And we've got, I think one of your colleagues here is from the monitoring and evaluation part of natural resources. But you need monitoring and evaluation for every major project that the country is going to undertake. Did it work? Is it being spent well? And that system, how do you do it? How do you test? Do you sample? A lot of that is economic design. So really, you can put a shorthand in it. It's spending the money and watching the money. But it's all very technical stuff. So I think those are all jobs for economists. And then, the job that the center is doing also, and that Natasha, as an economist, learned here at the University of Guyana, but it's how do you develop a workforce of the future? What's the incentive system? How do you increase wages? How do you create competition? How long does it take? And you can design a system that will actually deter growth. If you make it too hard for somebody to open a business here because they can have to have, you know, if you were building blowout preventers, you said it had to be 90% Guyanese content and 90% Guyanese technical personnel, and you don't have the technical qualification or the capability, what do you end up with? No business, no blowout preventers, or things that go boom. So, so that design of getting the balance right, trial and error, that's an economist's job, and data collection, making decisions, I think as Professor Mohamed saying, not based on emotion, not based on feeling, but making decisions based on data. I mean, that's classic economist. But there's a hard job in there. How do you design the census? How do you collect the data? And then what do you do to it? How do you produce studies out of that? How do you make it publicly available? So I think there's like centuries of work for economists in this economy, but it's a different kind of economics. It's not theoretical economics. It's really practical. It's applied economics.
Vivian, Ministry of Natural Resources. Can you expound a bit more on the patient and capacity building paradox that you referred to earlier?
To which part?
Can you expound a bit more on the patients?
Patients, yeah.
And the capacity building paradox you
Sure.
referred to earlier? Thank you.
The asymmetry between the expectations of the public and the ability of the government to deliver, it's a problem everywhere. It is a core problem in every resource-rich economy. And that's because as soon as the contract gets signed, people want to see where the resource wealth is. And it takes 8-10 years. I mean, how long it was, it was, I think, 12 years between the contract and first oil. Four. So you have a lag, in that period, and then it takes time to develop the programs that are going to be around for public spending. So even building out the education, the other systems, you have to have a tender, you have to have project design, and then you spend it. And it takes time. If you do it in a hurry, you're likely to waste it or do it poorly. But if you're a citizen and you're waiting, you want to know, where's your share of the wealth? You see the shiny new equipment that's offshore and you're wondering, when am I going to see some benefit out of this? All I've got now is higher prices, competition for housing, and the wage rates haven't gone up, so everything's more expensive, and I haven't gotten any benefit, and tell me again why this is a good thing. So it's really asymmetrical, and so it takes some patience. It takes the job. I think the government needs to do a good job of explaining how long it's going to take and when benefits are going to come. But I think you have to understand just how long things take, that it takes a while to pay back the investor. It takes a while to get the money out of the system. It takes a while to find the person to build that road and then get it built. And so, it may be here that the large-scale benefits of infrastructure development are really going to be 2027 to 2037. It's 2023. That's 4 years away before it gets started. It seems like a long time, but if you borrow a huge amount of money to try and do things early, you get into trouble and you squander a huge amount of your resource. And if the oil price drops, you can end up in deep trouble. So that borrowing now on income later is not, you can do some of it, but it's not very wise. So it requires this patience. It requires patience to understand how long it's going to take for things to develop. But I think, so I think I have sympathy for the government, I said, so I think you need to be, they're entitled to some patience for how long it's going to take to do it, but they have a responsibility also to explain the timeline and to be candid about what it is. I think that's insurance for them, even if an opposition criticizes them, no matter, frankly, who is in power. But if you don't get emotional and you just give the facts and say, this is how long it takes to build a good road or to build a bridge and to do the procurement, but here's our plan for 10 years, this is what's going to happen, I think you'll get more patience. But if you just ask people to be patient and you don't tell them what the roadmap looks like ahead, you're not going to get very much patience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goldwyn. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We have come to the end of this session because unfortunately we're running out of time. except the Vice-Chancellor. Would you like the final comment in this session? Okay, are there any other questions from the students?
Thank you very much. I'm not a student anymore, but I think it's important that the students be aware that Guyana is a signatory to the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, and also they joined the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And this year, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And that event is being hosted by the government of the United States of America. And it will be held in Georgia in December. So you can do some more research on that topic. It's very important because almost all aspects of today's presentation is linked to corruption and anti-corruption in some way or the other. So the more we learn about that, the better for us. Going forward, I would like to ask maybe with your expertise and experience, traveled around the world and studied and researched the resource course and so on, would you be able to identify some specific areas or specific countries with specific anti-corruption policies and mechanisms successfully? Thanks.
Sure. I think whistleblower statutes, which allow people to report fraud and to bring basically private lawsuit. We have that in the United States. We have a whistleblower statute. I think they have that in probably a good part of Western Europe. So you can report a fraud, and if you're not part of the fraud that you're reporting, then if the person who perpetrates that pays triple damages, and you get a share of that. So they call them private attorneys general. That's largely I think in Western countries. Nigeria, I spent a lot of time advising that government created an anti-corruption agency. You could give private reporting, and they had prosecutorial powers. And it was EFCC. It was called an Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. And while they've had governments there that have supported that, they have brought a lot of wrongdoers to justice. A lot of times, it really depends on whether you have part of the government that seeks to root out fraud, and you have a place for people to go to report it. And that's whether that's reporting the companies that are taking the bribes or the people who are making the bribes. But it needs a legal framework for reporting and accountability. I think the gentleman next to you had a question, and a student here.
Yes,
so
that's a follow-up, quick one. Guyana recently established the Anti-Corruption Committee. And in that committee, we have 16 representatives from 16 government agencies there. They're all public servants. And is that a reflection of independent monitoring? Or is that there's some conflict there? When you have a government employee put into this committee, his job and his livelihood and the livelihood of his family is dependent on that. So the likelihood for him to execute the instructions of the bosses.
I think it's really what the system design is. I mean, every U.S. agency has an inspector general. They are a government employee. They can't be fired by the government in power. So the question is, how do you set up the system? And their job is to root out fraud in the agencies, and they do it. They're not always the most popular people in the building, but they can't be fired. They're paid well. They have security. They have staffs, and they have investigatory powers. And they bring people to account all the time. So it's really, sometimes you want an outside system, but generally it's more how is the system designed and what is the security of the person.
We have another student.
And,
do you have a student here? Okay.
Yes. Students take priority.
Good day. My name is Cliffy Relax. I'm representing the Rotaract Club of University of Guyana. My question is, it seems pretty broad, but how do we make accountability more digestible to everyone, as in the ordinary citizen who might fall off during the process?
accountability isn't always digestible for everyone. And I think that's part of the challenge. I think you have to have enlightened governance in order to put in systems of accountability and realize they might turn against you or your agency. I would say, one way to make it digestible to the people who are in power is to think about legacy. Do you want to be the person who has put it together in a system, that for generations will hold people to account if they do wrong? And you can look back and say, I'm the president or I'm the cabinet agency, I put that into power. Do you be one of the person who said Nigeria beat or other countries beat the resource curse? In Nigeria, President Obasanjo started EITI, Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, and budget monitoring because he wanted his legacy to be the one Nigerian president who wasn't corrupt. It didn't totally work, but it was legacy that drove it. So I would say here in Guyana, does this administration want to be the one that beats the resource curse, that puts together inspectors general in agencies or external monitoring or that kind of accountability? I don't know much about the judicial system here, how independent the judiciary is and what access there are to legal services. But legacy, I think, for government is how you make accountability digestible. For citizens, I think it's something you demand. It's like, we're going to be part of this and you want us to be patient. Give us assurance that you're going to be good stewards of our money. And so you can demand that accountability. So, it's always digestible when it's pointed against the other person. I think it's never very popular when it's pointed internally. But I would say for government officials, many administrations across the world, the United States have done these, have survived crises, have survived instances of corruption that have happened on their watch because of accountability. So it's a little bit of a formula for political survival, because if there's an accountable system, if one of the people you appointed did something bad, at least you can say, we had a system that held them to account, and we used it, and we're moving on. They were brought to justice. Nobody's perfect. I think that's about the only way, but you're, getting started on accountability, if you don't have, you need enlightened leadership and you need self-motivation to do it. Otherwise, you're inviting political risk, and that's always a tough pill for politicians to swallow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goldwyn. Any final question from our students, or that's it? Okay, we have one final question, and then we'll close this session.
Hello, good morning. My name is Samaroo. I'm a representative of the University of Guyana's Chemistry Club. My question is, in terms of managing resources, is it advised that you have a fund just in case of any disasters that may occur during procuring the oil and gas?
Yes, I mean, that system, so the U.S. has an oil spill fund. We actually started it after the Macondo disaster. Before that, companies were just expected to be responsible for cleaning up their messes, but then it turned out in Macondo, they actually didn't have the responsibility, they didn't have the kit, basically, to do that. So you can do that in a lot of different ways, how you design that. You can create a fund which companies who are exploring pay into. You can have that so it can be a contribution. It can be a form of insurance that they're required to carry, which pays for damage when it's done. And then we have a hybrid system in the US where you also can let people participate in a collective oil spill, if oil spills, what you're worried about, oil spill response team. So you have multiple operators who contribute to, and they take a share of the ship and the booms and the labor. So everyone doesn't have to have their own, but you have a system in place that's capable of addressing the worst case disaster that you think you might face. So there are lots of ways to do it, but I think you have to do it. And my understanding, there are folks here from the Natural Resources Ministry, I think that requirement for spill response is something that's actually already in place here. So that's been done. But I think you absolutely need to do it. And you need to have, not just in oil and gas, but in mining and other places, you need to have a system because for disaster response. And you also have to have a system for when people are done with their mining or they're done with their well, in order to close it up and remediate it and bring things back. Big issue in the United States right now. We are hugely undercapitalized in people closing up wells. So we have thousands of abandoned wells which are leaking methane. And so now the government has got new money and we've got a program for people to close those old wells. But the better system is that when you grant the right in the first place, you include remediation in your mining requirements, or you include, well closure and disposition at the end of it as part of it, and you make sure that that money is set aside, not the government's money, but the company's money. That money is set aside in some way so that gets taken care of even when the operator leaves. So absolutely.
Mr. Goldwyn, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for quite an enlightening and engaging conversation. I'm sure that this conversation will go on and on. It could go on and on. And our students would like to mingle with you a bit after,
Yep,
but I'm told
absolutely.
you have to rush off. So if you give us a few more minutes of your time, that'd be really good. So UG is very proud to be creating this space for this discussion to continue in the months ahead, and I'm glad our students are showing quite a lot of interest in the conversation. So thank you all very much to our students who are here. And we have a little presentation for Mr. Goldwyn. I'm inviting the students to come along with VC Mohamed, who will make the presentation. Please do not leave, students. We want a photograph too with Mr. Goldwyn. And also, to wrap it up, we'll have a final vote of thanks from the president of the Economic Student Society. So please bear with us. Yes, please. Students, could you please come with the Vice-Chancellor as we make a presentation and take some photographs. Quickly. You guys need to smile a bit. Right, thank you very much, VC, and thank you very much, Mr. Goldwyn and students. I'll ask Alicia Samaroo, President of the University of Guyana Economic Society, to go say the vote of thanks. And then please, you're free to mingle with Mr. Goldwyn following the ceremony.
Good morning, everyone. I am Alicia Samaroo, a student and the president of the University of Guyana's Economic Society. It is with great pleasure that I deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of the students and the administration of the University of Guyana. The University of Guyana remains thrilled to partner with the Center of Local Business Development to host the Join the Conversation speaker series. Mr. David Goldwyn, did I pronounce that correct? You delivered an informative and engaging session with us students and staff today. UG, in its 60 years, has consistently promoted nation and individual development through information and action. We surely do hope to once again have these informative sessions hosted here in the future. As we bring this event to a close, Today, the university wishes to extend sincere gratitude to our speaker today, Mr. Goldwyn, for your interactive and informative session on managing resource wealth, what we have learned. Thanks to the Director of the Center of Local Business Development, Dr. Natasha Gaskin-Peters, and staff for making this partnership possible. We also wish to extend thanks to Vice-Chancellor Professor Paloma Mohamed and all the members of the senior management team for supporting programs and events such as these. Thank you to the entire DECC team. Our MC today, Mr. Jainarine Deonauth, the Director of DECC. Thank you very much. Thanks to the entire PACE team and members of TOS and the maintenance department. It was a pleasure being here today, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you all.
Thank you, Natasha. Ladies and gentlemen, the program has now ended. Please feel free to mingle with Mr. Goldwyn before you leave. I think he has about 5 minutes more with us. Yes. So students, you have the opportunity, please. Thank you.